let's pick up where we were yesterday. So what we had started talking about yesterday is what will be the din as far as the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKein. Now, we're talking about the designation of witnesses and how witnesses can sometimes and cannot draw up a promissory note. So what does this have to do with the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKein? So you'll see in just a second. He says, Yesh levarer mahu haderech hanachon legabe mitzvah shiluach hakein shirotza ha'adam l'kaima. What is the correct protocol if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of shiluach hakein? Now, first of all, in the parentheses, he says as follows: Da'afal gavda lefi mashmos hashas sof chulin da'amru yochol yachzor beharim bechulei muchach de'eno chayev lachzor l'kayim mitzvazu. He says the language of the Gemara implies that you're not obligated to try to find an opportunity to do this mitzvah. Va'ayin shut chavos yorisim in saman zayin mikol makom midivrei ha'arizal mashma shetzarach liishtadel l'kayim mitzvazu. But it sounds like from the Ari that you should make an attempt to fulfill this mitzvah, because this mitzvah has implications on a spiritual realm, because it's really a metaphor for trying to, the relationship between God and Israel, it seems like. Kemo shekasav abirke Yosef siman Yoredeya siman reish sadi bezos ches va'ayin sham pischei tshuva sifkat aleph. Now, I gave a shir on this a number of years ago, and there's a tshuva from the Chasam Sofer, who says emphatically that there's a machlokas between the Talmud Bavli and the Zohar as to whether there is a mitzvah to fulfill, whether a person should make an attempt to fulfill this mitzvah. The Chasam Sofer says that any time there's a conflict between the Bavli and the Zohar, we go like the Bavli, we go like the Talmud Bavli. That's the general rule. And it was on that basis that the Chasam Sofer says, you're not obligated to try to track down this mitzvah and try to fulfill it. However, there are many people who want to try to fulfill it. And the fact of the matter is, because really the Gemara only implies that if you want the eggs and you want to take the eggs out of the nest, this is how you must do it. But what if you don't want the eggs? They're pigeon eggs, and they're not something that we would normally want to eat anyway. They may not be that, that good, and especially if they're fertilized eggs, who knows at what stage of gestation they may be at, so it's not something, so you really don't have any reason to do this mitzvah. If you want to fulfill it based on Kabbalistic interests, based on what the Arizal says, okay, so now the question is, how do you go ahead and do it? Ha'im tzarachu lahafgir makom hakein kidei sheyuchal l'kayim mitzvazu, o efshar gam b'li. He says, are you obligated, because the Torah says that it has to be baderech, it has to be in a public area, do you have to declare that the place where the nest is made is a place that's hefker? So, v'sagi b'ameh she'eno chafetz liskos al yedei chatzeru b'beitzim. Is it sufficient to just say, I don't want my courtyard to acquire the nest or to acquire the eggs? And therefore you don't need to do anything. You can just say that my property did not acquire the nest or the eggs, and therefore that's sufficient. He says, because the first thing that we have to clarify is that this mitzvah can only be fulfilled if when it's not mizuman, when it's not sort of set aside and prepared on your property, right? Od isahasam tana rabbanan yone shovach v'yone aliyah chayafim b'shiluach hakein u'makshinan Allah b'imisala de Reb Yossi bar Chanina damar chatzer shaladam konalo shalom midaito karikan yikarei prat lemizuman, because the Brisa says that doves that come settle in your dove coop and settle in, let's say you set up, there's they would set up structures where they knew that birds would come to rest. So there is a mitzvah of shiluach hakein from those places, and the Gemara says, if a person's property acquires everything that rests in it, even without his deliberate, intent, then how can you fulfill the mitzvah? You've already acquired the nest and the eggs. Umasik hashas hashta damar Rav Yehuda Marav Asu Liskos bebeitzim shem Ravetzis Aleihem shenemar teshalech teshlach esaim v'hadar v'habonim tikach lach kol echad de'ihu lo matzi zachi lo zachi lechatzera. And the Gemara concludes that your courtyard does not automatically acquire the nest, or the eggs, at least I should say, since the Torah does not grant you the rights to those eggs until you do the mitzvah shiluach hakein. Since the Torah does not grant you the rights to those eggs, even if you were to pick them up, until you send away the mother bird, your courtyard cannot acquire it as well. So he goes through this long arichos that maybe you don't really have to do the formal declaration of making something hefker. And let's see where he gets to at the very end. This is why this is so lengthy over here. Okay. What? Well, we got here because, right, so we're because he's going to tell us that a person should do an act of making something hefker in front of witnesses. So so let's see, he's going to get to it at the bottom line. Yeah, to Lefiza. Okay, so let's get to the bottom line. Okay, bottom line is, he says, Nafgalon diyochol adam lomar, she'ein ritzano shechatzer yikna lo es habeitzim. A person can say that he doesn't want his courtyard to acquire the eggs. He can make that declaration. Gamim habeitzim adayin einam ba'olam. Even if he just sees the bird building the nest and the eggs have not yet been laid. The kaven shehabeitzim einam nasim shelo rak al yidei kinyan chatzero. He says, because the only way that the eggs become yours is through your property acquiring the eggs. Agam de kinyan chatzer nasa gam shelo midaito. And your property can acquire objects even without your intent. Mikol makom ein ze memela ki yerusha uperos dekel o advarim shabal zocha b'mal yedem yisuin. He says, but it's not like other kinds of acquisitions that take place automatically, let's say through inheritance. The sham hu zocha b'hem memela v'lachein lamol b'hem siluk rak sheyesh lo kvar shayachut b'hem. He says those things happen automatically, and therefore you can't, after the fact, withdraw ownership from those things. From, let's say, if a parent dies and you inherit their estate, you can't then just, without a kinyan, withdraw from it. He says, but as long as a person makes a declaration that he doesn't want his courtyard to acquire the eggs even before they're laid, you have a right to do that. And as long as you make that desire known, you won't automatically acquire it. And so therefore, a person does have a right to say, I don't want my property to acquire. You don't have to make an active declaration of hefker. You could even say it before the eggs are laid. I don't want my property to acquire the eggs that are laid on the property in the future. So I think the way we got here is because he's dealing with the idea of making a kinyan. I think that's the way that we get here, is because we're talking about the act of making a kinyan to create a sense of indebtedness or acquisition. And so therefore, that's why the Dibra Maskal is shehiknalo. How do you prevent an acquisition from taking place? And he says this is how you can do it, as long as you make a declaration that I don't want my property to acquire the eggs that have not yet been laid. You can do that. So as soon as you see a bird nesting, if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKain, we've had 2 nests built on our property in the last several years. And you can just say, as you see the bird building the nest, I don't want any eggs that are laid to be acquired by my property. Okay. So then we said that even if there's a long time, let's go back to our halacha. If the loan was made a year ago and it was done in front of 2 witnesses, and they made a kinyan, that implies that the debtor is happy for paper to be drawn up. So even if a year elapsed and the creditor comes to the witnesses and says, can you please sign this IOU? They have every right to sign it. And they don't have to worry that maybe the debt was paid off, because all they're writing is that on such and such a date, like he says, Bekosvin's mana kinyan. They write in the document the date that the kinyan took place to create the debt. Okay. Let us continue in the. So the Likutim writes, he says, Nechlaku haposkim imol kinyan suder ba'akum. The machlokis, whether this kinyan chalipin, what we call a kinyan suder, using this handkerchief mechanism, does that work for a Gentile? So the Shulchan Aruch pasak the moel, the Shulchan Aruch says it's perfectly fine. The Hashach sham sifkat lamed b'fakve kal ze ayin chan, and the Shach is not sure. He says urei Mishnah Berurah. He says take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Now, why is the Mishnah Berurah going to deal with this? Because this is in Hilchos Pesach. When we sell our chametz to the goy, we have to use all different methods of kinyan. So I think it's 6, if my memory serves me correctly. I use 6 different methods of kinyan when I sell the chametz to the non-Jew. And the reason is because there's a difference of opinion as to which is the most effective method, which methods of kinyan work and which methods of kinyan don't work for a non-Jew. But we do a kinyan chalipin, but that's only one of the methods. And then we specify to the Gentile that in the event that one of these methods of kinyan that we're employing is not effective, we want the other methods of kinyan to take effect. This is all written in the document. Yeah, in other words, you're basically saying we're covering all our bases. It could be that according to some legal authorities, method A works, method B doesn't work, method C works, etc. So we just want the ones that don't work do not invalidate the ones that do work. Exactly. Okay, let us continue. All right. So we really have finished the sif in the Imrei Yaakov, because this whole lengthy biurim was all about the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKain. And I have to tell you that based on the Chasam Sofer, I no longer feel compelled to do the mitzvah Shiluach HaKain. I understand that according to the Ari, some people may want to do it, but it is important to let people know that maybe it's not such a mitzvah. And especially if you have compassion on the mother bird, leave her alone. In other words, the Vilna Gaon actually writes that the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKein involves some level of cruelty, because by sending her away, you're causing her great grief. He even points out that this is why there are only two mitzvahs in the entire Torah, where the Torah says, Laman yarichun yamecha. In order, if you do this mitzvah, you'll have length of days. Kibbut Avayim and Shiluach HaKein. He says, what's the connection? So his thesis is, there's a lot of Torah on this, but his thesis is that these are two opposing mitzvos, because Kibbut Avayim requires compassion for your parents, and Shiluach HaKein requires cruelty. And the only way that we know that you're truly an Eved Hashem is if you do mitzvahs that require both, both opposite ends of the spectrum of character. So in other words, because if you only do mitzvahs that involve compassion, maybe it's because you're a compassionate individual, right? So how do you know that you're willing to serve Hashem even if he asks you to do something that goes against the grain of your personality? So therefore Hashem says, do these two mitzvahs, and thereby you'll demonstrate that you're willing to do anything, even the things that go against the grain of your personality. So, so maybe I would tell a person, do it once in your life, be yotzei, but don't try to run and find the opportunities to do this mitzvah, because if you don't want the eggs, there's bichlal no mitzvah whatsoever. Maybe on a Kabbalistic level, there's the idea that it represents some kind of metaphor between God and Israel, but it's really not something that you want to try and do, because every time you do it, you're causing grief to one of God's creatures. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. Okay. Everything that we've learned up until now is if two people have been designated as witnesses by the people who are making the transaction. Let's say a loan is taking place between Reuven and Shimon, and they go ahead and they say to these two guys, please be our witnesses. Aval acherim shelo nisyachadu la'ikdus lo yichtavu shelo midas hamischayev. But if two people witness the transaction without being designated as witnesses, and then later on, and even if the kinyan was made between the malv and the lova, the creditor and the debtor, but the debtor was not aware that this was being witnessed, or he did not designate these two people as witnesses, then the two witnesses do not have a right to draw up a promissory note without the consent of the debtor. She'im lo kain, im hayu sham harbe b'nei adam, kol shnayim behem yichtavu lo shtar. The goiva. He says, because let's say we did it in front of 10 people. Let's say I go over to a guy at Minyan and I say to him, can I borrow $1,000? And he says, sure. Let's make a kinyan. Okay. Look, we got plenty of witnesses. Everyone's here. They can see what's going on. If the lender afterwards goes over to two guys and says, do me a favor, draw up an IOU that you saw, right? And that way I'll be able to collect it if the guy doesn't pay back. Well, what's going to happen if he does that? If there were 10 guys, he goes over to 5 different groups of 2 people, right? And he tells another group the next day, draw up the promissory note. The other 2 witnesses are not aware that he already approached another group of witnesses. And so therefore he could potentially end up holding on to a bunch of different promissory notes and try to collect multiple times. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to create a situation where a creditor could incorrectly collect the debt more than once. So therefore, you only can write up a promissory note for a debt either if the debtor expressly consents, or if you were designated as the exclusive two witnesses on the transaction. If you're designated as the exclusive witnesses on the transaction, so then it's implicit that they are authorized to draw up a promissory note. The cholze b'mischayev litain, avol hamochel davar lechavero b'fnei edim o patro me'eze chov shahaya chayav lo kosvin v'nosnin lo shalom midaito b'chol in. He says, but everything that we've also set up until now is only when a debt is generated. Let's say a debt is canceled. If Reuven goes over to Shimon and he says, I hereby cancel the debt, you don't owe me anything. And he does it in front of witnesses. Okay? So in that case, even if there's multiple witnesses and no one's been designated, they are allowed to write in a piece of paper that they witnessed Reuven moichel the debt to Shimon. And the reason is, he says, why is that? He says, Shalom b'chol inin v'afilu lo nisyachadu le'edim, even if they were not designated as witnesses. As we'll look in the commentaries and we'll see, because in that kind of scenario, you're not generating debt. So there's nothing that can go wrong with that, even if there are multiple notes that are written. Because even, let's say there are multiple notes that are written, they're just basically saying that there was a cancellation of debt, not a generation of a new debt. V'chein hamoda lechavero b'fnei edem, kibalta mimcha kach v'kach al chovi yashata chayav li, v'af al pi shelo omer lahem halo atem edem. Or another example would be, is if Reuven goes over to Shimon and says, you have paid me back in full. You've paid me back in full for the debt that you owed me. If he does that in front of witnesses, then even if the creditor does not authorize it, the witnesses are allowed to draw a paper for that kind of public declaration. Okay, so we take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. So the first case is lo yichtavu. The witnesses should not draw up a note if they have not been specifically designated as the witnesses on the transaction. Aval im heidu ba'al peh edusam edus im kafar ze be'ikar hadavar. Aval im omer parati neman. So let's say Reuven lends Shimon money in front of a whole group of people. And when the next time that Reuven asks Shimon to pay back the debt, Shimon says, I don't know what you're talking about. Reuven has a right to pull over two of the guys that were present when the loan was made and say to them, will you testify before me in Beis Din? This is when paper has not been drawn up. They are allowed to testify in Beis Din. Yes, we were witnesses to this loan that took place, say after Minyan. Okay, that is something that is admissible in Beis Din, and if Shimon denies ever having borrowed money, he's going to be in trouble because there are witnesses that are testifying against him. If Shimon is smart and he says, of course I borrowed money from you, but I paid you back, so then Reuven no longer has a case. Because basically, just because it was done in front of witnesses doesn't mean that Shimon has to pay back the debt in front of witnesses, since no one was ever designated. The only time we say that if you lend money with witnesses, you should pay back with witnesses is if witnesses were designated. Because if witnesses were designated, why didn't you get witnesses to demarcate the repayment of the loan? But here it just happens to be that people were witness to it. So the only time they would be able to incriminate Shimon is if he says, I never borrowed money. So he's directly contradicting their testimony. Okay. V'gova, that the creditor can collect based on the paper that the witnesses write up for him, and that's not correct, therefore, for witnesses to write up paper, because maybe there are multiple witnesses, and the creditor will ask each group to write up a different note, and then he'll be able to collect multiple times. So he says, "B'chidushe Rabbi Akiva Eger Tama al Dinzeh, the Hare Kaimelan de Kosvin Shover Vimkain Shuv Lekala Mechash Lazeh Ayin Sham." Rabbi Akiva Eger is disturbed by this halacha because we paskin in the Gemara that once a debt is paid, the creditor is supposed to write a receipt to the debtor, which says paid in full. So therefore, why should you have to worry about that? And I guess the answer would be, in other words, we're not going to fully be able to answer it, but simply put, is that what if the borrower doesn't want to have to hold on to a receipt in perpetuity? He just wants the promissory note torn up. He has a right to demand that as well. So bottom line is that witnesses should not draw up promissory notes without the consent of the debtor in this kind of scenario. Okay. Avol hamoichel, but then we said that if a person forgives a debt or makes a declaration, "You've paid me back in full," then even if witnesses were not designated, but they just happened to see it, they can write up a document that attests to what they saw. So kaimelon mechila ein tzarich kinyan. So we paskin that when you're moichel a debt, you don't need to make a formal kinyan on that transaction. In other words, just a verbal declaration, "I forgive the debt," is enough to cancel the debt. V'atam mishum shemiyad shemachalo nistalek mimenu hamoichel. He says, because as soon as the creditor forgives the debt, that in itself is a form of withdrawal from any kind of connection between the creditor and the debtor. And so that's basically the creditor, in other words, by releasing someone from debt, you don't need a special kinyan. The machlokas, however, is what if the creditor still is holding on to the promissory note? Does a verbal forgiveness of the debt still work without making a formal kinyan? Or is it necessary to either tear up the note or to make a kinyan in front of witnesses? Okay, the yesh omrim de tofas shtarchov biyado kolzman shelo machzir lo miyad lo mahani bei afilu mechila gemura below kinyan. He says that some opinions say that as long as the creditor still holds a promissory note, then a verbal forgiveness does not help unless a formal kinyan is made, which symbolizes that the promissory note is no longer legally valid. Because of Hashach, the Husfeika Dedina. And the Shach says that it's not clear. In other words, he basically ends up by saying that it's a suffix, whether it works or whether it doesn't work, a verbal mechila in that scenario. So therefore, I suppose that if there are witnesses in that kind of scenario, even if they testify that they saw the creditor being moichel the debt, if he still has a promissory note, it's going to be a suffix whether the debtor still owes him the money or not. Kosav Maharshal. Okay, we'll hold it here for today. This is where we'll hold it. Okay.